Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's talk, discussing Francis Bacon, which is being held in relation to the reading room display, which if you haven't had a chance to see it, please do. It's under the bar in the Fox reading room space. This is a wonderful evening in terms of temperature and everything, and I'm really grateful to you all for coming tonight, because I'm sure you may have all been tempted just to run into the park opposite rather than come indoors, so thank you. I would like to introduce my panel, if I may. Paul Rousseau, closest to me, collection manager at the John Deakin Archive, and Massey, art historian and professor of design at Middlesex University, who has written extensively on the independent group and authored the ICA's recent book, Institute of Contemporary Arts, 1946 to 68, published last year. Victoria Walsh at the far end is head of programme Curating Contemporary Art at the Royal College of Art. Prior to joining the Royal College of Art in 2012, Victoria Walsh was head of public programmes at Tate Britain between 2005 and 11 and has published extensively. Unfortunately, Rena Ira can no longer be with us this evening. That sounded very dramatic the way it's written there, but I think it's simply because sadly something came up at the last minute which he's had to attend to. A reader in visual communications at University of Wolverhampton will not be with us this evening, forgive me. Just to say that we're here to talk about primarily an exhibition that was held at the ICA in January through February of 1955. We've been holding a number of events in an attempt to try and explore this particular exhibition and the work of Bacon at that time, among other things. And the first event that we held was a rather wonderful evening with Melvyn Bragg. For those of you who were there, you may recall some of the extraordinary insights that he had into his various meetings with Bacon, which had taken place over a number of years, perhaps culminating in his interview for the South Bank show in 1985. And on Friday, we launched the new autobiography on Peter Watson, entitled Queer Saint, a title bestowed upon Watson by Cecil Beaton, as taken from his diaries. To suddenly know more about Watson has proved deeply fascinating, certainly for me, I hope for others, and also timely. Not only was Watson one of the original founders of the ICA, but he was very supportive of Bacon up until Watson's own untimely death in 1956. Watson curated the ICA Bacon show from 1955, and Watson's extraordinary network would also mean he would play a part in securing the loans, which he did. There's a letter downstairs, evidently, which would have been written to the then owner of Two Figures in the Grass, Anthony Denning, who was then a Vogue photographer, is what we have. And it's also important to note that Watson translated the catalogue essay for the Bacon show, so you don't just get a sense of a man with a sort of arm's length approach to curating the show. He was involved in securing loans, he was involved in translating essays. He was most definitely involved in the show. Just to say that the ICA then was a members' institute. The reason why I mention that is because it still is, and also the important thing is that if I go on to say things like the Francis Bacon show held at the ICA in 1955 was one of his first solo institutional shows, I want to just qualify as we move along a little bit more about what the ICA's position would have been at that time. Somewhat different to what we might expect of a museum, but nevertheless a public-facing organisation. The Hamilton 57 exhibit was restaged by us as well. I just wanted to mention this, that we created two early Hamilton works last year, which were shown in the lower and upper gallery. In the upper gallery, you saw an exhibit from 1957 being recreated. I will show you images shortly, but I just wanted to say that this was a very important exhibition for us, the Hamilton Show, and it was something that coincided with a very real interest that we had to start to work on a book and to begin to talk about the first 20 years history of the ICA. And it was something of a little bit of for me, very important bit of news, which I talked to Anne Massey here, because Anne was absolutely instrumental in creating this particular book, and it came as perhaps no surprise to me that this book was all sort of somewhat in Anne, and I just had to sort of draw it out gradually, but it was an incredible process at speed in which Anne just knew a great deal about many of the key exhibitions held in that period at the ICA. Actually, at the back of the Green Book is a listing which pretty much is a good chronology of every talk and event and screening that ever took place in that time as well. So it was precise at times, but what was interesting was that as we began to explore this period and as we were reaching a deadline to go to print around the end of 2013, early 2014, it suddenly became clear to me that the Bacon show did indeed constitute Bacon's first ever solo institutional show. Now that's an important bit of information for an organisation like the ICA. The ICA has talked at length in recent years about its ability to launch artists and its ability to promote and be at the cutting edge, but to be pioneering, and in doing so they've often laid claim to having given Damien Hirst his first ever solo institutional show. Richard Prince has had his first institutional show here, and to sort of give a sense of the importance it might be for the artist as well as the organisation is that Richard Prince for some time would credit in his biography in the back of catalogues his exhibition at the ICA, and in brackets say first ever institutional solo show. It's important for artists and for organisation as Fisher, Chapman's, etc. could all lay claim to this in various ways, but what was really key was that actually I hadn't found any information to point to this before we were going to press, and at that time it occurred to me to check in with various people, and they also seemed to agree that this was the case. I then wanted to find out more about the exhibition, understandably, but this wasn't going to necessarily prove very easy. Put simply, we don't have the resources here to run off and do such detailed examinations of our past, and in fact we don't even have an on-site archive. So I just really wanted this to be a very simple display, the one that's on presently downstairs. In all honesty, I just wanted to show the installation shots, possibly find a picture of Bacon in the ICA, possibly carrying his ICA membership card or standing under an ICA banner, something that would locate him at the ICA. But this was not going to be necessarily the case. Also, I may add that as we were working on the book a little bit before the print deadline, we were sensing that that Bacon's star was rising yet again, and it was not long ago, in about November from memory, in the November sales, that Christie sold 3 studies of Lucy and Freud from 1969 for a record-breaking price of $142 million, it being then the most expensive artwork ever sold at auction. ICA had previously laid claim to its connections to Picasso, but oddly not Bacon. And this was very odd for me, seeing as Bacon is a genius and is one of the most important artists of the 20th century. So where did we go next? Well, we went to Tate, or to be more precise, the Tate archive. The ICA archive was sold to Tate in '93, so the archive from 1946 to 1987 exists in the Tate's archive. So I have to go there, and apologies for people who may have heard this story before, but it is it's grounding when, as director of the ICA, you have to go to the Tate Archive, present your passport, show them your business card, tell them who you are, and then go in and then be sort of slightly monitored as you go through the archives for the organisation of which you're a director. So it's a discombobulating moment. But what I might hope that we, anyway, more importantly address here today is why this exhibition is important for the artist. Why it's important to the organisation, and why should it remain important to us today. And I talk about I want to talk about the exhibition. I'm a curator as well. Exhibitions interest me. As I say, there is real interest in Bacon in terms of the market, and there's obvious and continuing interest in individual works. But for me, exhibitions in spaces become important things, and they become things that I would like to talk about, if I may. But for me at least, when we approach this exhibition, we do start to see various questions circulate around the identity of certain things, certain objects. The identity of the artist, the identity of the institution, and perhaps the identity of London. What was London like at this time? I just want to, if I may, and we will come to the panel shortly, forgive me, but I just wanted to show a few images, some not in the display downstairs, but that's the ICA membership card, form, forgive me. It's actually from 1948. And I just wanted to point out that, as I say, that ICA set up, and I hope to get more from Anne on this, but the membership scheme was very, very important to it. And I just show this picture, which is the later work by Richard Hamilton, an exhibit, which I also like to put here as a bit of a tease when we might come to talk about mirrored objects in the room at the ICA in Dover Street, which is what you see here. This is the original ICA. Presently, you would find it by going to the first floor of Dover Street Market. And it's, I think, the Dior concession at the moment. But this is 57 an exhibit, and the reason I do show this, other than some other comments I could make, is that there's a lady in there who's manning the ICA member's desk. Day membership was as possible then as it was possible now. I would point out it's cheaper now, but then you would have come through the door just to her right, and you would have been confronted, as it were, by the front of house, which is that lady sat there, and you would have perhaps been asked to show your membership card or to pay day membership or to consider joining as a member. But it was a clearly public facing organisation. You could walk off the street, walk up the flight of stairs and become a member of the ICA, and certainly see exhibitions with relative ease. After really quite an enormously long time, and again, much of this talk, forgive me, is a sort of plea for anyone out there who may know more about this show. This is not about me closing this discussion. We don't know enough about the exhibition. I would love to know more, and if anyone does know more, I'd really welcome news of that. But this is a wonderful image taken by Derek Berwin, and it shows Kate Mundy. We know this is written on the back of the photograph. Our research wasn't so detailed that we didn't know, we noticed that, and it's a lovely little thing because you see her in front of a crucifixion, and it is perhaps one of the images that most helps us see a painting of Bacon's in the ICA, but it's not actually that easy, but we're just very glad that it's in the ICA archive. It's in the body of photographs that are associated with this show in the archive, and so we can, I feel, fairly confidently say this is an image of a Bacon painting in the ICA archive. But it needed still substantiation of sorts, and so we were very, very lucky to find this second photograph, and there we see the same lady on the same day, and this we found through Getty Images, not the ICA archive, and it shows the same ICA staffer, Kate Mundy, this time stood before Study of a Nude. I just mentioned that because those are the two pictures that we have at the moment of the Bacon show. This picture is mysteriously being shown on an easel, and in both photographs you see the photographer is not really interested in the paintings at all. He's interested in the reflection of Kate Mundy in the glass. Both photographs are taken at angles which actually put the reflection, as it were, in the centre. She's standing close up to the paintings so that you can see her reflection more clearly for the photographer. This picture is actually really rather wonderful and a good day for us because we could see the same window shutters that are presently still in the ICA former building at Dover Street. Those windows really do kind of make me feel very certain this is taken in the ICA. However, the Bacon painting on the easel is not necessarily, I suspect, how it was shown ultimately. But I want to come back to the reflection, and that'll come back to the panel, and this is something that's again iterated in reviews that don't actually seem to address some of the content or subject matter of the painting specifically. They more often talk about a kind of overall darkness, and it's interesting. The Guardian just think he might be a fleeting sensationalist. They got that wrong, I feel, and I think the other thing is interesting to see the Architectural Review at times refer to them as interesting space dividers. And so it's an incredible thing in which the reviews tend to sort of round on this thing, other than general darkness and in certain cases general irritation with the design of the paintings. There's a sense of this reflection being very important to the show, and that you walked into the ICA and you would have been, in many ways, seeing your reflection multiplied across the space. There's something as well that is also being suggested that that these reflections are probably, this is in the, Daily Mail mentioned, no doubt to push them further away from us. The idea being that the mirrors are somehow reflecting us away from them, which is something that I would again like to talk about in a bit. This is the list of works that was shown in Venice, and it's the Venice show that first reaches the ears of the ICA, because mysteriously and rather wonderfully, Peter Watson, Herbert Reed and Penrose are on the Venice Committee for the show in which Bacon will appear with Freud and with Nicholson as the headline, as it's later shown on the Venice Biennale catalogue for that year. But these works are being murmured about as something that should maybe come to London and be shown there as part of what's being talked about as a retrospective. This is the actual list of works as they appear in the catalogue. What happens next is an interesting discussion takes place. The ICA Board Notes, which I was lucky enough to read at Tate, are interesting in that you get the sense of a kind of a word said at a board meeting where Penrose reports that he'd heard from David Sylvester that the Tate Gallery would not be showing Bacon's Biennale exhibition. They wouldn't be taking that show. Mrs. Somerville had been consulted, and there was no objection to the ICA arranging a retrospective exhibition of Bacon's work. It was agreed to hold it sometime after Christmas. The Bacon show is now happening, and Watson is seen to be the curator of it, and it comes to London. Tate won't go on to show Bacon's retrospective for another 7 years in 1962. It becomes his first retrospective at Tate Gallery, now Tate Britain. But this is the Bacon invite card and catalogue, the card on the left functioning as the translated essay and of the list of and serving as the thing that will the device to carry the list of works. And these are the works that were shown in the exhibition. I'm going to flick through, if you don't mind, and I'm going to, at times, point out what paintings were in Venice, of which there were, as I understand, only 3. So it's a different show from Venice, much different, changed. And perhaps one has to ask, how did that come about? Was it the discussions that took place between Watson and Bacon? Was it perhaps even discussions that took place with the lenders who wished for the return of their works? But we do begin to see a different Bacon show. oddly, it also important to note that this is the painting which Herbert Reed has become associated with promoting, as well as promoting Bacon in his Art Now book before the war.
It obviously looks like two bodies writhing around in the grass. What I find interesting about it is the dark area at the bottom, which looks like this. That is part of the painting. It looks like an underground, as if you're disappearing below the grass. And so, that, like you're saying about queer readings, the fact that there are kind of hidden details underground, strikes me as being a sort of something that might have queer connotations to it. But yes, it's from Muybridge, which the book came from his friend Dennis Worth Miller. Yes, I'm sure that, because I remember when I looked at it when I was young, the fact that there are naked men wrestling around in it was actually kind of like a bit of a frisson. So I'm sure in the 50s, when images of naked men, fit yet naked young men, were slightly rarer than our saturated age today, I'm sure they did create a frisson. And it might have even been the original reason why you would show somebody the book if you're both gays, look at these. What I think is interesting, though, is the shuttering that is in a lot of the pictures in the 55 exhibition, by which I mean the stripes in the background, the flickering kind of effect, which kind of seems to be related to coming kind of into focus and out of focus, or into being and out of being, which again is if you want to keep looking for them, is a queer reading. Is that you might say that, others have said that through the 50s, a kind of an ability to be queer or gay or homosexual started developing, whereas before the war, the war changed everything. Of course, it even changed the face of London. But before the war, sexuality, Matt Holbrook says this, sexuality was understood as being binary, essentially, which is that, by which we mean that if you're a man, you fancy a woman. If you're a woman, you fancy a man. And so if you're a man who fancies a woman, you are by necessity being woman-like. And this would impact the way that queer or gay or homosexual men would comport themselves. They would wear makeup, they would pluck their eyebrows and draw them on. Bacon is known for using kind of queer coding or queer language in referring to men as her or she, which is another kind of classic sort of trope. But post-war, this kind of fell away as an identity was able to be developed and formalized and even discussed. The language, you need to have the language to discuss these things, and that developed post-war. Pre-war, you would talk about inverts and the difference between perverts and inverts. Apparently there is one. But post-war, that even the police in 1937, the first time it's recorded that the police would use the word homosexual was in 1937, whereas the use of queer for gay goes back to 1915, I think. So all these things Bacon would have been aware of in the air and in his own conversation. So there's a queer reading there if you want one. Of course, he's rich enough and great enough that there are lots of other things going on. I'm sure.
And Vicky, just while we're here, and apologies, you may have to talk closely into the mic. I don't know what the police cars were doing just then, but anyway. But Vicky, exactly. But Vicky, can you just give me your thoughts on this show? I mean, just looking through those paintings there, something that I've only got recently is how much Watson may have been involved in the hang, but it's quite a particular body of works.
Yes, I'm sitting here like a very bad art historian because I'm not really one, trying to remember my dates and facts. And somewhere along the lines, I do know that Lawrence Alloway was involved in hanging the show, whether that's in Lawrence's letters or his diaries at the Getty that I've seen. But I published, and there is a citation somewhere, so I'm sure it was like a double act. And I think, from my point of view, Alloway's involvement at the ICA and my understanding that he was also involved in the show is quite important in terms of understanding the exhibition as a curated form, as setting up a set of interrelationships. And particularly in relation to Alloway, historic confirmation suggests he was straight. There may be other readings of Alloway yet to come. But But I think one of the things that Alloway was very interested in at this time, he was also planning and working on This Is Tomorrow, was the idea of the exhibition as a coded field of communication.
Yeah.
So the notion of a kind of visual lexicon, a different visual language being set up between works, which although we don't know what the arrangement was, I think there's something worth understanding, and the relationship to photography in there as well, as about what the photograph can tell, and the reflection as another field of communication is quite interesting. And for me, looking at this particular image, particularly I was at a lecture last night by a terrific French academic curator, Jean-Louis Cohen, who was talking about the discourse and practice of camouflage in post-war Britain. And when you look at this, even on this version, I'm looking and thinking, yeah, you know, there was so much in the Architectural Review written between 38 and 55 about the technologies that have been created and the painting and the patterning of camouflage. And certainly I know that Richard Hamilton had taken that idea of camouflage into a kind of surrealist lexicon of curating. So all that notion, this is not, we look at them and perhaps you think of them as museum exhibitions, that they're objects that are there and to be read as individual items. But actually I think the final thing I would say is the entire exchanges that were going on amongst this particular set of individuals, which Bacon was part of, and Sylvester, was always the discussion that there would be one visual clue, one key that would unlock the meaning of something. And that discussion had really taken place at the ICA in 1953 around parallel of life and art.
Yeah.
This idea that there's a key to unlock the meaning of an exhibition, not works, but the works together. And I wonder now whether this was the key to reading the exhibition.
Can I just draw you on that? Because I think that's become an important part of our age, for want of better words, is that curated exhibitions are at times attempting to be more than the sum of their parts. There's a temptation, and Anne, don't worry, I'm just flicking back through certain images just to pull other works back into view, but there's a temptation here in my mind to sort of sense that there is a bringing together of works which is certainly not just a touring show from Venice, and I'm sure that loans could have been arranged. Watson seemed very effective at that in his life, and certainly the question that I always end up asking is, why was the show never photographed by a man at the time who was one of the richest men in Britain? But I'm told that nevertheless photography was never necessarily always key to exhibitions back then, and photography bills could bankrupt certain organisations if they weren't careful. But this thing of these works coming together in this period, certainly post-50s, it strikes me that something is being attempted. I just draw you on that idea that that's what curating shows is in a way about at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a pivotal moment where the ICA, I think that's also where the independent group enjoyed the ICA as opposed to Tate, was that it understood that bringing works together added up to a politics of culture, politics of the visual, which was not the way Tate was thinking about displaying works at that time. And I think the other point I would make about it is that I would be very surprised if photographs of this exhibition do not exist.
I hope they do.
I mean, from my experience, which I've talked about here before on this platform with Richard Hamilton, was Growth and Form. There was only 1 or 2 photographs, and in fact he had an entire stash of them. And I think the kind of relationships between Hamilton, Bacon, Sylvester, some of these relationships are not yet quite fully understood. The interface of contacts, I got to know, my interest in Bacon came through David Sylvester mentioning to me that he used to go to football matches, and that this artist photographer I was interested in, Nigel Henderson, was key to Bacon's thinking and relationship to photography and the photographic image. You need that one moment to send you off somewhere to look in someone else's archive. And I think there was also this other thing that Richard Hamilton once alluded to, which was that exhibitions or other memories, this archiving, which I think Anne can talk about very well, this kind of archiving was also a way of communicating. So archives were made and then handed on to somebody else as gifts, as part of also that coded communication. And as I've talked about with Growth and Form, which was in 51, which they would have all understood, although it looks like one thing, it was in fact something else. And the language of camouflage and surrealist sort of meta-narrative was entirely running through that. And Hamilton had trained as camouflage artist. So this idea of exhibitions looking like one thing to be accepted in the norm and being something else. And Bacon writes himself and speaks in one of the interviews in 55 about the obligation of exhibitions to leave an impact on the social order, I think he calls it, not the visual order, which the IG are interested in, but changing the order of things. So I think for that to be able to be possible, one would have to imagine there was something else going on in the exhibition than just the single work.
And feel free to add at any point, but just to you, Anne, this thing about the reflection is very of great interest to me, because it strikes me that with these particular works, large scale, black works, dark blues, blacks being behind the plate glass mirror, it absolutely plays up reflection. It encourages reflection. And as we see, there are many thoughts at the time about this being a show in which there are these mirror-like paintings. Except what's interesting here, and which is where I would disagree with the Daily Mail, perhaps not for the first time, but it's the idea that they actually are paintings that you go into. In fact, they remind me very much of a similar relationship that one finds in Manet's Olympia, where you become the client as the viewer. Just by looking at the painting, those flowers are being sent by you and proffered to the lady on the bed, and in many ways what we see is an almost updated version of that. Your reflection in a painting such as Man in Blue 1, for instance, puts you almost in the room, and it actually makes you a part of the scene, perhaps.
Yeah, I suppose it does, yes. And I mean, if we think about the room in which the paintings were hung, it was quite similar to this in terms of windows and dimensions, so that it would be quite difficult not to have a lot of reflections if they were glazed, I guess. But I think, to me anyway, responding to these, they seem quite almost dark and not pulling you in, almost pushing you away, I think, as a viewer. But I'm responding differently, perhaps.
I think the thing about reflections is that it makes viewing them a kind of a physical, almost like a physical exercise. You'll remember when you try to see them now, you have to kind of get yourself into position of them, and so it becomes like a physical interaction. It's interesting that all the images that we see, all these images that we have, when we look at them, look at Bacon's paintings in books, they're completely flat. There are no reflections. They're very often not even the frame, and it just reminds us that, or reminds me that the thing about art is being in front of the painting and looking at in the book. It doesn't can get you so far, but it doesn't actually get you, of course, anywhere near what the experience is like. The other thing about reflection is that if you're studying to see something, and these are particularly talking about the businessmen. If you're struggling to see something, again, you're trying to understand something, and as I was saying before, the process of queer identity as it developed through the 50s was trying to understand how you could be a gay person or a homosexual person when it was against the law. These men are all kind of like in private spaces on their own. And the sense that this is related to perhaps the meaning of the exhibition is that the only two words that they wanted to remove from the Sexual Offences Act was in private. They didn't change anything else apart from from the law to legalise homosexuality. It's just those two words, in private. And these are, there's a kind of like a poetic connection, perhaps I can suggest there.
One thing that would be difficult to ignore, and I just remember seeing it written very briefly on occasion, that the show had taken place and that the Wolfndon Committee is referred to and is often put into the sort of backdrop for the show taking place. But Paul, while we're there, I mean, as we went more and more into this, we began to notice that it was a very dynamic space for the beginnings of what we might see as reform of the ways in which the law was dealing with homosexuals and prostitution in general. And the Wolfndon Committee is becoming very active at this time, but also there is front page headlines referring to the Montague case, in particular the case where we know Peter Wildblood, Lord Montague and Michael Pitt Rivers were concerned. So this is not something that's sort of hidden away in a corner of the back pages of the papers, and there is a sense that this is a period in which being a homosexual is a somewhat different experience than it might be today. Tell us more about how you think that London and being homosexual in that period of time would have been.
Well, it was different according to your class and your age, really, I suppose. But the book Queer London by Matt Holbrook is excellent about this. But I don't know, it's difficult. But I also don't think that we can go too heavy on the queer readings of these and the queer readings of the exhibition, because there's a kind of like a level above that, which is perhaps more enlightening, if I might say something like that, is that if you're going into this space, as the ICA was a semi-private space, you're entering into a kind of like a shrine to these paintings, and these are paintings that you would be aware were somehow kind of dangerous or transgressive, and so you were engaging in a conversation with the idea of that space and with the idea of being that kind of person that has those kind of attitudes. And you might be gay or you might not, but gay people, because in those times, I say gay, homosexual people, because they would have had to kind of like construct an identity for themselves in which to exist, because you weren't allowed to be who you were. It's almost like you'd opened a door. So the fact that these may have queer readings, these paintings, is kind of like one step before you get to the idea that once you've opened your mind, you can think a bit clearer and a bit more widely about other things, about society more widely. I think it's interesting that the Sphinx was included, which, to be Sphinx-like is to not divulge your secrets, but also that the Sphinx is the guard to a shrine. And the Sphinx also, it's interesting that it has kind of like a dual gender. In classic Greek mythology, the Sphinx, I think, is female, but in Egypt it's male. So there are kind of like these kind of like flickering ideas of going backwards and forwards between things. Again, about the shuttering, I think it's interesting that, by which I mean the stripes, that this space that they exist in is somehow a liminal space, is what's called a liminal space, which is something that's between states. A liminal space is that you go through a process, but you're one thing at one time, you go through this process and you come out the other side as a different kind of being. So the space in between is called a liminal space, and it seems like these paintings exist in a liminal space, but also that the ICA was in a liminal space. It was semi-private, semi-public. You had to pay to get in. Once you're inside, you kind of like were expected or perhaps expected of yourself to develop some sort of particular ideas that you may not talk about outside, or in public, but when you were in there, these ideas were safe or expected.
Does that tally with your thinking, Anne, about what the ICA would have been at that time?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. I was just absolutely agreeing with what you were saying, and kind of thinking about the broader history of the ICA. I often think of it as a kind of haven for people. If you think about Peter Watson, and there was that whole surrealist kind of quite transgressive sexuality anyway that wouldn't have a label at all, why should it? And there's the whole Burgess and MacLean's scandal. I mean, there's lots of examples where this was quite a haven, where it was a place you could go and perhaps feel safer. So your reading, I think, is really interesting in that regard. Yeah.
Vicky, just to talk about the relationship between Bacon and the independent group, and I mean, there is often a thought about a thought came up around putting the show together about the Latigue photograph, how it appears on the cover of Richard Hamilton's exhibition Man, Machine, Emotion, which takes place in 55, and is reappears with the two figures that one sees behind the back of the car, reappears in, I think that's qualified in a sense, or at least was mentioned in the recent tape retrospective, that, and Bacon, I believe, acknowledged the Latigue photograph as being something where these two figures we see on the third panel came from. But can you just talk a little bit about Bacon as someone in relation to Hamilton and Paolozzi and so forth, because this is a very interesting dynamic. I mean, Alloway came in and initially rounded on Bacon as saying that citing the birth of pop art in Britain as having started with Bacon's work in 1949. But are there connections to be made, or is it all at arm's length? Bacon referred to them, the independent group, as mixed media jackdaws.
Well, I think the main thing to always remind ourselves is just how extraordinarily sophisticated and strategic Bacon was about the communication and construction of his own persona and identity and narrative, and that manipulation of the perception of himself in the public. And so the whole separation out from his contemporaries, the whole construction of the narrative of him as a unique genius, his more active, I would say, engagement in trying to create a lineage with 19th century Romanticism, both here in the pre-Raphaelites as much as in France with Baudelaire and others. And the comparisons that were often being drawn between him and Whistler and Wilde, both in terms of the paintings, the whole blue tonality as much as the dandy, the language. But of course he was very much moving around with the people, and he was here, and he was drinking with them, and he was going to football matches with Nigel Henderson and Paolozzi and David Sylvester, and they were all drinking at the Colony, so they were all mixing together. So the narrative of having nothing to do is one thing. The rejection, this kind of thing of nothing to do with the mixed media jackdaws, I think was this trying to separate out his relationship to more popular visual culture. But I think that narrative is one more, I would have said, was more market-related and public persona construction-related than to do with the aesthetics. In terms of kind of the aesthetic debates of the independent group at that time, I think he was absolutely fundamentally engaged, and I'm sure Martin Harrison, who's got much more grasp on this as well, could add to it, was the relationship to photography. And I think, and again I've said this sitting in this room, I think we historically have a very, very naive understanding of what photography meant in the 1940s and 50s. We look back at so many of these photographs and think of them as having an indexical, documentary, pure relationship to representation, when in fact the whole mediation of these images was in relation to an understanding of photography as conceptual, that it was a form of image making. It wasn't a... And so how photography and the photographic image is used as a source material, reused, like a kind of developing an image bank, actually, again, is another form of kind of coding and recoding. And this is very much happening. It's like collage, but you sublimate and you hide an archaeology of layers of meaning as these images recirculate and get reused, so that they become a kind of symbolic shorthand. And the reason to remind ourselves is that all of those exhibitions at the beginning of the ICA's history were photographic. Wonder and Horror of the Human Head. That this tradition of having exhibitions, and that wasn't just about cost or about not being able to access images. This was actually about understanding the photographic image was doing something different. There was a different engagement with art making and visual. And Hamilton particularly understood that. And they the writings around photography at this time and the correspondence, even Rayner Banham writes in Architectural Review in '53 about photography. This is a new conceptual, strategic use of photography. This is not photography as we understand it before. So there's very sophisticated use of it, and it's also sort of creating a kind of different kind of intertextuality, not only in one artist's work, but with reference to other artists using photographs. So, as we know from, again, Martin's work, although Sylvester had said that Nigel Henderson stressed images that had an impact, we know that they were kind of reused, and they were found in Bacon's studio, and then kind of repurposed, and then they come back in somebody else's work. So you have this kind of recycling of imagery. And that, for Paolozzi, was also a fundamental strategy, so that you end up creating a new visual language within a certain kind of community of interest, which is really what Richard Hamilton's, what is it about today's homes that are so appealing, which becomes this kind of, you can, I don't mean reduce, I was going to say reduce, you can read it like Jean-Paul Stonnard has in the Burlington magazine and train spot every millimetre. I don't think that actually tells you that much when you just break it down into elements, because actually, again, it's the whole. It's like a curated image, it's a curated exhibition. And there are lots of clues in there. And John McHale, one of the other independent group people, has suggested that the tin of bacon, which says
spam,
ham, is an indirect reference to the fact that Francis was in this group. Now, McHale, you can take that reading of the tin of ham next to the bodybuilder, next to the iconography of, homosexual magazines, fashion magazines, bodybuilding magazines that were circulating in certain networks. So there are some clues, I think there, but I think the one thing I would want to say when I was talking at the beginning about coded communication is I didn't use the word queer or homosexuality because I think it reduces the value of Bacon's work to think that it takes it back to having some representational interest. And I think very much, first and foremost, Bacon was interested in seeing what he could do with paint in relation to representation and in terms of reimagining what its capacity to communicate was outside of representation. That was his anti-stance to English Romanticism and English narrative, Victorian moral narrative painting. So I think we shouldn't forget the texture and the materiality, and then you get the glaze and the glare.
Paul, did you want to say something to that?
Just that, no, it was just a slight comeback, but that there's kind of like a heteronormative, if I can use that heavy-handed word, assumption that when we discuss art or discuss Bacon, that if we discuss sexuality and if it's gay sexuality, that we reduce it, and I'd just like to push back slightly against that.
Yeah.
That I think perhaps some of the most interesting things, now that so much has been said about Bacon and we're still talking about him, which is an indication of his genius, that some of the most interesting things, and I don't claim to be one of them, but some of the most interesting things, new things to be said about Bacon is in reflection to his sexuality and what that meant to him and what that meant to his audience.
I have to say I slightly support this view, if you don't mind, just simply because I think as a painter, there's of course pushing paint, knowing what to do with it. In a way, what distinguishes his work on one level, let's say to the independent group, is that his position in relation to the photographic image, and he is combining that with his ability to sort of paint to a point where images may occur more fully in the mind rather than finish them. And I think sometimes in this, it's not just a struggle with paint. I think he's motivated by what he wishes to represent. I'm not wording that at all well, but I think that does give for rich readings, actually, and doesn't actually necessarily close it down. But just a view. I'm simplifying things enormously, Vicky, by just saying that the position Bacon had to the photographic image is markedly different, I feel, to the IG's relationship to it, partly because of sexuality. If I were to put Bacon next to Hamilton, I don't maybe feel quite as, I don't feel that there's the work to be as sexual. Maybe that's just my not getting as excited about it as I should. But I wondered if there's a relationship and a distinction to be made. The IG refer to the photographic image in an almost wholesale appropriation way, as you mentioned earlier, the sense of it being something that can be taken and can be moved about in ways reminiscent of mass popular culture. Bacon seems to almost have connections through pop to even artists like Richter and capitalist realist painters of the time, and let's say, where they're again blurring images into other spaces. So it's not a normalized image being appropriated or represented, it is worked on, and it is worked on partly through a desire to represent something, but no matter how ambiguous. I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
I think I may not have put it well enough. I'm not rejecting that when I'm talking about the emphasis on paint, but I think trying to suspend the readership of visual culture as being explicit and direct and representational, I think was a fundamentally shared objective between Bacon and the independent group, because at stake was a reimagining and a recognition of the fact the world had changed and a new visual order was in place. And I think what they shared, and I mean, I'm interested, I don't know, a transcript may emerge about the panel discussion around the exhibition. I saw from downstairs that it was Anton Ehrensweig and 2 other people in that panel discussion, that what was at stake was a new politics of culture, and that was as much about sexuality as about class. It was about trying to create a new kind of order of who could control meaning making and image making, and that it wasn't anymore an elitist practice. And I think we have to remember that painting is deemed to be the highest still of the fine art orders at that point. And we shouldn't forget, as I always say, that it took Tate until the 1980s to be able to buy a photograph, because it was a reproducible medium, and the first curator was only from 7 years ago or so. So we shouldn't forget what that kind of institutional kind of status of painting and photograph is.
Anne, what's your feeling about Bacon in relation to IGA? Do you see...
I think there was a very strong connection, and the fact that Laurence Alloway writes him into the history of pop art, essentially, I think is really important. And if we think about the whole history of this and the whole history of the archives, isn't it interesting that we can't find any information about this exhibition? And isn't it frustrating by the same token? And I just wonder why that is. Because if you go through the ICA archives, there's more information about most of the other shows that took place, most of them do have at least 1 or 2 installation shots. So that's quite interesting to muse over. And also the fact that last painting was added in pencil, I think is fascinating. And we could start thinking, I mean, it's tempting to kind of shed light from our own perspective on the past and to bring our own preoccupations and project them onto what we're reading in history. But there's a lot of work at the minute about queering the archive and about looking at histories that aren't necessarily part of that norm. And I think that kind of resonates with the independent group and with their whole kind of project about upsetting the cultural status quo, which was definitely what they were about. And the ICA gave them that platform in which to do that in quite a kind of tolerant parental kind of way, like the rebellious teenagers. They were sort of given space and even places to live and work in the case of Paolozzi. So that's how I'm thinking about it. In terms of queering the archive, I think it's quite an interesting trope to start thinking about this whole exhibition and why is it being left on the margins.
I think if we can safely say it was transgressive, which I think it seems to sit, and I think the idea of this this show, while I could step back from it and say there's not a declaration of it wishing to be in itself queer, let's say, but nevertheless for the queer canon and the queer archival thoughts that may flow out of what you're saying there, this show nevertheless has a position in that to be discussed in that way, even if we talk about the work in other ways. And I don't wish to, forgive me, I don't wish to belittle it in that sense, but it is going to take a root in that way, possibly.
I think so. Well, perhaps, and I mean, in terms of art history, there isn't any one right way to look at anything. And what we'd like to encourage, I guess, as art historians, is to encourage a plethora of different interpretations, and none of which is any more right than the other. Do you know what I mean? So what we're doing here is looking very much in the terms of kind of an exhibition history approach, but there are other ways to look at this, and no one is more right than the other, I think.
I think it's a brilliant show and reflective in many, many ways, and deeply coded, and I think veiled in numerous ways. And yet what I find as present director of ICA, one point of interest for me is that it was transgressive, and in a way, one of the reasons why I find it an important exhibition is because it began to alter and change not just the reputation of the ICA, but its cultural value, its position. And subsequently, the ICA became the place later for many transgressive performances, bands, events. We could talk about Genesis Peorage, we could talk about transgender film seasons, but it became the institute of choice for transgressive art, still is, and I can't help but trace it back a bit to this show. So in other words, an important thing for me about this exhibition, why I find it important, is because it's programmed the ICA in a way to be what it is in the present. Paul, do you agree?
Yes. I don't know if I'm qualified to have any weight on that, on my agreement, but yes. I'm here because you were interested in the John Deakin photographs.
Please,
that are included in facsimile copies downstairs. The gang of trannies, I suppose, if that's what they are, who knows. Interestingly, when we started looking at using the Deakin images in this show, was realising that Two Figures in a Garden was included in the show, the pre-war painting. This is a really complicated sort of connection, but there is a weird sort of coincidental connection to the Deakin photographs just in that painting. Is that on the back of one of the Deakin prints, the one of Audrey Cruddas, the only woman in the group, whether she's a tranny or not, I don't know if that works. But on the back, the only text written on any of the backs says Audrey Cruddas, costume designer of The White Devil, which is a Webster play that may be connected to Two Figures in a Garden. In the Tate catalogue, it's Martin Harrison. It seems strange to be quoting him as he sat in the room, but talks about a letter where Bacon says he something along the lines of he managed to bring off a fish in a painting that seems to refer to this painting Two Figures in a Garden. So there's a weird connection between somebody that Deakin photographed. There was a production of The White Devil in 1947, which apparently Bacon couldn't have been at. But there was also a 1935 production of The White Devil by Webster that Bacon could have been at. I don't know. So there's a strange connection there. It doesn't really signify anything apart from just an uncanny sort of coincidence that bothers me, which is probably why I'm wittering on about it unsuccessfully.
Vicky, if I just may ask, how much more is going to unravel around Bacon, and in particular Bacon of this period?
Well, I mean, I think uncanny. I think that's most probably always a very good starting point. I mean, I think one of the things that's if you get interested in Bacon and you get lost in the land of Bacon, is just how incredibly erudite. And the reference just multiply, and you end up tracing, and it's not wrong to do that, because we forget the quality of educational, and the exposure to literature. B, Bacon himself talked about that, his greatest source and his greatest inspiration was literature, not painting, and his polymathic knowledge and quotations. I mean, Sylvester writes, that the citations and the quotes in the painting from literature are more than from the visual. We see the visual, it's very obvious, it's a kind of misleading sometimes. So I think a lot more iconographic reading in relation to literature would take us a lot further. But I think there's a lot more in archives to emerge, and presumably there's a lot more to come when the catalogue Raisonné comes out. I think there's most probably a lot in other archives of people who are yet to be catalogued. There are all sorts of archives of this generation that are now coming through. I mean, the Hamilton archive, when it emerges, I think will have a lot. The Ehrenzweig archive, and Ehrenzweig was very important, is there. I think people like J.D. Bernal, there are people, we have to remember these are not just, the problem with this kind of solo disciplinary is we look at archives of people we already know about and not the ones whose histories we've forgotten. So the scientists, the architects, the designers, the engineers, there are so many other people. And I think it'll be in some of their diaries that you will see other things. So I think there's a lot more to go. And I think, as often is the case in any environment to do with art, one shouldn't forget also the figure of Duchamp. I mean, I think Duchamp was, hugely important for most of the independent group, both as a surrealist and a conceptualist. I mean, I think it's hard not to think about Rousseau, the circulation of the green box at this time, and all sorts of other things. But I think photography is still one of the big areas to think about and talk about and link that kind of visual lexicon and circulation of images, both in architecture press, other forms of photographic reproduction, Life magazine. I mean, there was an exhibition of Life magazine photographs here in '53, the same year as Cartier-Bresson, and Robert Duano comes in. I mean, they're all, so you've got a whole, I mean, this is the home of photography at that point, and nowhere else is. As far as I don't know, is there anywhere else in the 50s in London showing photography? I don't know. I don't know. Somebody else will know.
I definitely want to pass the mic round in a second, but Anne, just before we go there, any more thoughts on the archive? I mean, it's become increasingly important to me to be able to reach out and touch it.
Which is quite difficult when it's at the train. Yeah, I mean, as Vicky said, there must be loads more stuff out there that will emerge, and particularly from the point of view of design, I think this is quite often overlooked. And I mean, Francis Bacon began life as a designer, so we shouldn't forget that either. So as well as photography, I would say, what about design?
I'm going to wrap it up, if that's okay. Just to say, as earlier, if you find any pictures of a Francis Bacon show from 1955 in Dover Street, will you please let me know? I'd really like to thank tonight's panel. They've been incredibly generous. Join me in thanking Vicky, Anne, and Paul. Thank you very much.